Okay, hi, welcome everyone. My name is Anthony Monta. I'm the Associate Director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at Notre Dame. This is our European film series on the spirit of '68. It dovetails with a conference that's going to occur here in April on 1968 in Europe and Latin America. So we wanted to kind of prepare, seed the field for that conference in advance of it. Trying to say something new about rock and roll and the Rolling Stones is a little bit like trying to say something new about the plays of William Shakespeare. You know, but I'm not really talking about rock and roll tonight. I'm talking about a film, which is different. One thing that you can do when faced with a band and a film as well known as this one is to put it in a new context. And to that end, I'm offering you GIMME SHELTER, Order and Chaos in the Long Global 60s. But I'll be merciful and just touch on a few points. The first point is that you're about to see a 35mm print of this film. It's in good condition. There's some signs of wear, but it's great to be able to see this in the original medium in which it was shot. Okay, first point. The Stones were an English band, which is part of why the Nanovic Institute for European Studies can show this. But they're arguably now a global band. And so that's of interest to an institute that's part of a School of Global Affairs. The Stones were a band that really mattered across an increasingly large part of the planet. So it makes sense to pay attention to what they were up to and what this film was up to. Number two, an interesting tension is implicit in the title of the song and the film, Gimme Shelter, and that kind of goes to the heart of what the film is about. It's the tension between the assertion of this personal desire, gimme, right? And the provision of protective, comforting shelter, presumably furnished by somebody else. And we might call that internal tension something that's characteristic of that phrase, but it's also perhaps a vivid tension in the 60s themselves, not just in America, but around the world, from Paris in '68 to San Francisco, from Chicago to Montevideo in Uruguay. The world saw strong assertions of personal desires and personal expression. We might call it the autonomous self, the assertion of the autonomous self, coming into direct and often violent conflict with broader social norms and institutions. And yet, as Jagger expresses in this film, there's also a desire to get together, to be cool. Gimme Shelter is a profound rendering of the necessity of understanding what's at stake in that tension. And it dramatizes an approach to achieving that understanding through watching. It's one thing that I would suggest that you really look at as the film elapses. There are a lot of images of people watching things and people looking. And what that means is kind of interesting. If these giant concerts were kinds of Dionysian revels, in which participants are enjoying this no-holds-barred pursuit of pleasure, sex, drugs, rock and roll, then the film shows us them being kind of unreflective about it. They're having fun. They're absorbed in it. That's something Friedrich Schiller might call, naive poetry. Poetry is not really unreflective or self-conscious about itself. But the film shows Jagger and Charlie Watts really reflecting on this. They watch footage. They watch the very footage that you're about to see, and they're shown watching the footage. And so that renders the emergence of something that's much more self-conscious, something that's much more separate, something that has distance on the events, something that's kind of Apollonian, what theorists have called. I like what Camille Paglia, for example, has to say about the Stones and the Beatles being sort of Dionysus and Apollo. There are lots of interesting things to say about that. I think that registers probably pretty accurately what the tension was like there around Altamont. People came out of Altamont feeling pretty shaken and with new questions. Rolling Stone had a huge article, I think just the day or the week after the concert itself, that had to do with the murders that took place there. So in a real sense, Gimme Shelter isn't about the 60s. It's really a coming-of-age film about what it was like to enter the 1970s. So that's basically the substance of my whole talk, and I just want to leave you with a couple of details. First, to put this in a temporal context. So in 1969, when this takes place at the very end of 69. So it's the last year, the last month of the 1960s, right? Last performance of the Beatles was in January. Eisenhower died in March. The taking over the SDA, the Student for Democratic Society national office, by the Weathermen and the Stonewall riots happened in D.C. in June. Chappaquiddick and the moon landing were in July. The Charles Manson murders and Woodstock were in August. The first draft lottery for the conflict in Vietnam was earlier in December, or was there in December. This is December 6th. So these are really troubling times. There's a lot of raw emotions here. And this year came after the years of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and the Kennedys. So it's reasonable to suggest that people in this film had some sort of premonition or sense of an ending. Look at the symbol on Mick Jagger's shirt in this film. The location, you all know that this is the Altamont Speedway. I'm not going to go into this at all. You should know that the Stones tour was very lucrative. They made $1.5 million, and this was the free concert that they were going to give to America as a sort of thank you at the end of that. It was kind of thrown together, the location, at the last minute. There were a couple alternative locations in the Bay Area. So it was, in a way, a kind of spontaneous self-organization. Jagger talks about that in the film. But the film itself was not spontaneous. The Stones partly financed the filming of the footage here. There's some footage of them in Muscle Shoals in Alabama where they're recording a record. They paid for the footage of that, and they paid $129,000 for the Maisel brothers and Charlotte Zwerin to shoot at Altamont. And the cameraman included, by the way, a young George Lucas. The reception of the film, well, one other detail, Tina Turner kind of steals the show in this film. There's an amazing scene, amazing performance of her. And it's interesting that the intensity of that performance is at a kind of pivotal moment in the film itself, because after that performance you start to get much more footage of physical confrontations, and I don't think that's by chance. Also, watch for a dog in this film. I haven't seen people talk about the dog, but there's a German Shepherd in this film, and I think Charlotte Zwerin, who was the editor, paid attention to the dog. Because the dog, a shepherd is, right, protection, right? But some things change with the situation of the dog. And last, the reception of the film. So critical opinion was very sharp about this film. Pauline Kael wrote a very famous review of this in which she basically accused the Maisel brothers of profiting from Meredith Hunter's death. I think she even used the word that it was they made money off of a snuff film, which is a really sharp accusation that the Maisel brothers responded to in print, and apparently rankled them for even decades later. And she had a very terse remark in response to that. But I don't think that's the most insightful thing she said. What I want to leave you with just this one quotation from her. We begin to suspect that Mick Jagger's musical style leads to violence, as he himself suggests in a naive and dissociated way when he complains, somewhat pettishly but with a flicker of pride, to the crowd that there seems to be some trouble every time he starts to sing Sympathy for the Devil. He may not fully understand the response he works for and gets. When Grace Slick and then Mick Jagger appealed to the audience to cool it, and there's extended, footage of this, Grace says, to keep your bodies off each other unless you intend to love. And Mick says, to get yourselves together. They're saying all they know how to say, but the situation is way past that. They don't seem to connect with what they're into with the results. Mick Jagger symbolizes the rejection of the values that he then appeals to. That's pretty stiff words to say about a rock and roll band. But again, this really isn't about the rock and roll band. This is kind of about what Charlotte Zwerin, as the editor, and the Maisel brothers are trying to render here about rock and roll at the very end of the 1960s. So I think we should thank them and their direct cinema cameraman for capturing that paradox in such exquisite detail. And we should also thank Charlotte Swerin for constructing a narrative here. It's not in chronological order. That raises more questions than it answers. And that's, I think, one more characteristic of really, really good art here in the 1960s. Thanks, and enjoy the film.